The video game industry has a lot of problems right now. There is aggressive monetization, gambling mechanics, sliding launch date quality, planned obsolescence of live service titles that are really just products sold under the false promise of perpetual or, at the very least, significant long-term support but then made obsolete by a sequel just a couple of years later, and a whole host of other issues that I've covered in the past and am still working towards covering in the near future. Today, however, I want to take a hardline stance against the erroneous claim that video games cause violence and articulate the delusion behind such a mindset, which has once again crept into the mainstream spotlight under the scrutiny of national media and political figureheads. The basic premise is that video games do not cause real-world violent behavior, but since even such a rudimentary point seems lost on individuals who perpetuate that claim, I'll be rounding out the discussion with a complete argument, breaking down why not only the central premise is wrong, but how, as a concept, it is intellectually dishonest and damaging. The focal point has been raised in the wake of what can only be described as an extremely tragic event. I won't go further on the topic because simply saying the words involved and discussing the material can result in any channel that is not a mainstream corporate news outlet being slammed with demonetization and other sanctions. If it were hyper-relevant to the discussion, I would likely ignore this, but the basic info is all that's needed. A series of events featuring firearms and tragic loss of life transpired yesterday, which led to a resurgence in the manufactured connection between video games and tragedy on a national scale. The following clip is from the Texas Lieutenant Governor.
And I say, how long are we going to let, for example, and ignore at the federal level particularly, where they can do something about the video game industry? You know, in this manifesto that we believe is from the shooter, this manifesto, he talks about living out his super soldier fantasy on Call of Duty. We know that the video game industry is bigger than the movie industry and the music industry combined. And there have been studies that say it impacts people and studies that says it does not. But I look at the common denominators as a 60-some-year-old father and grandfather myself. What's changed in this country? And I see a video game industry that teaches young people to kill. It's a lot of factors that go on that we have to take a long look at who we are as a nation and where we want to go and what we're going to tolerate from social media and from video games. I'm sorry.
The issues present here are infinitely complex. A manifesto of this nature is designed to have maximum media appeal and spark widespread coverage for an enduring period of time. And we have seen in the past that they can almost be a word soup of controversial terms, ideologies, and taglines. However, that is a tangent that really has to be left alone because even talking about it in an analytical sense can result in severe consequences for a YouTube channel like mine. The main point is the connection, or lack thereof in this instance, between video games and real-world behavior. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy on Fox News had this to say regarding the subject and the words of the Lieutenant Governor.
But the idea of these video games to dehumanize individuals, to have a game of shooting individuals and others, I've always felt that is a problem for future generations and others. We've watched from studies shown before of what it does to individuals. When you look at these photos of how it took place, you can see the actions within video games and others. But
Postscript, during the editing phase for this video, there was yet another instance that surfaced just now, fueling the fire that video games are the cause of recent tragedy. Here is Donald Trump lending his voice to the erroneous narrative.
Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately.
Here again, we see an emphasis placed on video game violence impacting real-world behavior with the assertion that there is causality between games and action. This is a widely accepted perspective, and periodically, after tragic events or catalyzed by other circumstances, the claim surfaces and attention is turned towards violence in games as a scapegoat for national grief and outrage. This is nearly subhuman levels of critical thinking, and unsurprisingly, the data actually points to the exact opposite of what these politicians attempt to correlate. The claim that there have been studies that both suggest and deny the existence of a connection between game violence and behavior is partially accurate. There are studies that attempt to pair video game violence with real-world behavior that creates inherent risk, but those studies are deeply flawed. One such study, and I should be clear here, there are not many studies that fall into this category because it requires dishonest mental gymnastics or an outright desire to fabricate and deceive, but regardless, one such study is a pediatric clinical trial that examined the effects of 3 Minecraft modes on children and their subsequent behavior towards firearms. I actually did an entire video dissecting this study previously, but the basic summary is this. The study had 3 modes of Minecraft, one with guns, one with swords, and one with no violence at all. Children ages 8 to 12 were made to play one of the 3 game modes for a set period of time before being sent into a playroom to be observed. The playroom had various toys as well as replica guns, and the resulting conclusion was that children playing the gun version of Minecraft were more likely to display dangerous real-world behavior and play with/pull the gun's trigger afterwards. Attempting to condense together all the things wrong with this study is going to be a task because it is so disgustingly incompetent, but I'll try my best. For starters, the sample size of children once divided into the 3 categories was only about 70, meaning there is a high likelihood that it is not accurate in a larger pool of results. Second, most of the results were deemed statistically irrelevant in their own study because the differences were either not pronounced enough or unreliable. Third, there is a scientific phenomenon called the mere exposure effect, which is extremely present in young children. The effect pertains to how an individual who builds familiarity with something is more likely to be attracted to it, and can apply to almost any event or interaction in all of human society. The study did not compare the likelihood of a child to pick up a sword after playing the sword version of Minecraft, it merely created a stacked environment to prove one particular outcome. Lastly, there were factors such as gun safety education that were proven to be extremely impactful, not to mention the fact that children ages 8 to 12 are technically outside the age bracket allowed for violent video games as per the ESRB, but none of these things were considered, and the headlines inevitably followed that violent games can cause unsafe child behavior towards guns. These are the types of studies that are referenced by those that claim there is data to support the idea that violent video games cause violent behavior. But the reality is that an overwhelming majority of credible data suggests not only the opposite, but a complex beneficial effect to video games, which is being entirely ignored either through deliberate malice or mental inadequacy. I'll spare everyone the multi-hour analysis of every single study in favor of a rapid-fire cross-section here, but I will also link everything down below for those that want to dive deeper into the subject. There are not only studies disproving a link between games and behavior, that is the first and easiest deflection here, there are studies that suggest a reduction in violent behavior in the wake of popular violent game releases. There are also studies suggesting that violent game players have a reduced likelihood to create hateful material elsewhere. When compared to real-world historical moments, tragic events in a school setting were perpetrated by an overwhelming majority of individuals who do not play violent games at all, while the exact opposite is true of a typical social setting. This discrepancy means that the majority of criminals perpetrating these acts do not play the violent games that are somehow attributed to their actions, while the adolescents that do play those games are not exhibiting any uncommon behavior at all. When analyzed by anyone other than a bought and sold crusty politician or a biased clinical trial with a framework deliberately designed to prove a particular outcome, it is blatantly obvious that video games have no discernible impact on real-world behavior in the context of tragedy and crime. But let's go one step further. If you somehow accept that video game violence does impact real-world behavior as a scapegoat for whatever tragic event is immediately fresh on the nation's mind, you suddenly have a massive problem. If game violence breaches the barrier of fiction versus reality, now we must consider hunting games and how they might be causing animal cruelty, or racing games, and how there must obviously be a link between street racing titles like Need for Speed and reckless driving. Reckless driving, by the way, harming far more people and lives annually than mass tragedies ever have and likely ever will. When you remove the logical barrier of differentiation between digital worlds and reality, you must then consider how media affects us. Video games, however ineffectual, are age-restricted, news stories are not, and yet news shows more graphic content, which is a derivation of actual physical real-world material, than pretty much any video game out there. When someone legitimately claims a connection between video game violence and real-world behavior, with the intention to regulate it beyond an age restriction or something like that, they are effectively claiming that all violence must be moderated and censored from society because citizens are incapable of making independent decisions and might be manipulated or influenced by it. This ignores an even more important discrepancy. Video games are a global phenomenon, and yet other nations simply do not have the same struggles that the United States does. Some nations have their own crisis events, to be sure, but the specific topic that is dominating the news cycle right now, about adolescent behavior driven by violent games, is not present anywhere else in the world because games are not the cause. It's a complicated topic to analyze why these types of events occur at all. I couldn't even begin to pretend to have an answer to that. And all these Twitter warriors telling you it's cut and dry because it's the Second Amendment enthusiasts, or the fault of the president, or because this or that, they don't know a damn thing. Most of them are just angry pseudo-intellectuals, which is kind of what I am too, I guess. But the difference is I won't pretend to tell you what did cause these tragedies, or claim that I know the way to prevent them. I definitely don't know that. I am merely asserting that I know one thing, which is not the problem, and that one thing is video games. It could be a function of various different lobbying groups, or even outright delusion, I'm not sure, but the narrative that video game violence is a cause and attribution behind tragic events in a real-world setting is political propaganda of the highest order. This is not even a partisan attack. Democrats and liberals have delusional ideologies around censorship and political correctness, using violence as a bludgeon because their violence against those that they have labeled as hateful or prejudicial is somehow morally justifiable when that label is foundationally incorrect, misplaced, or malicious. Republicans and conservatives have delusional ideologies of their own, such as the current narrative that video games impact real-world behavior, which has been parroted by many different representatives and party officials in the past and is the lowest form of intellectual dishonesty. But the issues at hand can never be solved if they are incorrectly diagnosed and attributed to an activity which more than likely has an inverse effect from what is currently being claimed. Video games do not cause real-world violent behavior, and it's time that all of us start correctly identifying those that claim that they do as either dishonest, agenda-driven, or unfit for office due to a lack of higher brain function. But that's it for today. Don't buy it. Video games are not the cause of tragedy, and the data supports the truth regardless of what is said by the mainstream media. If you want to support, there are links down below. As always, the goal is to transition to Patreon so as to not be subjugated by YouTube's fickle and overly sensitive algorithmic family-friendly pressure in favor of corporate interests, but enough is enough. It's down there if you want to click the link or whatever. I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.